Hi everybody, it's Mr. Bakley. Welcome back. This is our next video, our second video regarding imperialism. Today I want to talk with you briefly about the Spanish-American War. This is going to be just a little bit of enrichment that goes along with the other information that is already posted on Google Classroom, or I should say will be posted on Google Classroom. So let's get right into it and go over a couple of things. So the Spanish-American War, the big idea is that in 1898, the United States went to war to help Cuba win its independence. Now this became a thing because we were all about independence way back when, but now we're in this situation with imperialism because we want additional resources and we're balancing the difference between, for nations want to be free and they want to self-govern, and boy, but we really like your resources, and the only way to get them is kind of take them at this point, because we're kind of big on manifest destiny. So it became quite the struggle about what to do. The scales of justice kind of kept going like this. Why it matters: U.S. involvement in Latin America and Asia increased greatly as a result of the war, and it continues today. So Spain was once a dominating force of colonialism. They now face losing, though, in the late 19th century, most of their assets. The Cubans rebel against Spain. They just got tired. They got tired of the rule. They got tired of the oppression. And they just started to look at, okay, what could our freedom really look like? Now, Spain, as I said, was the most influential and powerful country that exerted influence over their colonies in the previous decades. But now, in the late 1800s, they were having a little bit of trouble with that. They did manage to hold on to, at this point in the late 1800s, they had lost a little bit of their influence, and they did manage to hold on to Cuba, the Philippines, and Guam, a few outposts in Africa, and Puerto Rico in the Americas, along with Cuba in the Americas. And those were pretty much their holdings. The United States was extremely interested in Cuba. They were very interested for the same reason they were interested in Hawaii. I'll get back to that in a minute. They had a long-standing interest in Cuba. They wanted to purchase it from Spain, but Spain said, no, thank you. We're not interested. As a matter of fact, the quote from Spain was, we would rather see Cuba sunk into the ocean than sell it to the United States. Between 1868 and 1878, the Cubans led a self-revolt against Spain, and although it failed, in 1886, they did manage to exert enough pressure over Spain to abolish slavery. So that was an excellent step forward, but not enough to win their freedom. When it did happen, though, the United States began to pour millions of dollars into Cuba as a result of gaining control or gaining more influence over their sugar plantations. So here we go again with sugar. Hawaii, for the same reason, was annexed because of the sugar, and Cuba now is gaining a lot of interest from the United States because of sugar. A second war for independence came almost on the heels of the first one, and this one was led by Jose Marti, who was exiled into New York City, but he managed to orchestrate and lead a rebellion, the second rebellion in Cuba. He focused his rebellion on something in particular, which was all of the interests, not all, but a lot of the interests that were held by the United States. And the reason he did that was because he thought that if the United States suffered enough losses in Cuba as a result of all of the millions of dollars that they were pouring into Cuba, that would drag them into this conflict. And he thought he could use the United States and their power and influence to win the freedom for Cuba. So he targeted U.S. interests. Whether that worked or not, we'll get back to that. Public opinion was split over whether or not we should side with Spain or whether or not we should side with people that are trying to win their freedom, because after all, the United States was right there. In order to side with Spain, though, we had to continue to follow something called the Monroe Doctrine. If you're familiar with that, I'm sure you are. Okay? And Grover Cleveland, who was president at the time, maintained the policy of the Monroe Doctrine, which said that we will leave alone or stay out of the affairs of European countries and colonies in the Western Hemisphere. Essentially, the Monroe Doctrine was, we'll leave you alone if you leave us alone. And that is pretty much the way President Cleveland decided to leave it for now. The war does escalate, however. Spain responds to the Second Rebellion by sending in one of their top generals. He decided the best thing to do was take the civilian population and round them all up and put them essentially in what was a concentration camp. And he thought that by doing that, that would help reduce the amount of aid they were able to give to the rebels. Okay, except for that brought about something called the headline wars. Now, you had two major newspapers that were going head-to-head, back and forth, maybe bickering a little bit. One of them was the New York Journal, and that was headed up by William Randolph Hearst. You may have heard of him. And the other one was the New York World, which was run by Joseph Pulitzer, and I'm sure you've heard that name before, Pulitzer. Okay, but they began to escalate the tension in Cuba because they started to write these very inflammatory stories about what was going on with Spain and Cuba, Spain in Cuba, and Spain with the Cuban Rebellion at the time. And these accounts were exaggerated. It was accounts like children being thrown to the sharks and wells being poisoned to kill off civilians and things like that. And this became known as yellow journalism. Okay, these tactics became known as yellow journalism. There was another piece that kind of escalated the tension with the United States, and that was a letter that was written by Spain's diplomat. And he wrote a letter after President McKinley took office in 1897. President McKinley took office and not immediately, but close to immediately, decided that he wanted to intervene diplomatically with Spain. So they did do that. And the initial talks actually did produce some success. They recalled their general who had created those concentration camps. They modified those a little bit. And they also gave some limited self-government to Cuba. So it was moving along. However, the diplomat from Spain to the U.S., the Spanish diplomat to the U.S., had a letter stolen from the post office that described McKinley as being a weak president, and this really angered the United States. So it added to the tension of how we were feeling, the U.S. was feeling towards Spain. The icing on the cake came with the USS Maine. The USS Maine was a ship that had been sent from the United States to Cuba. It was in Havana Harbor at the time. It was sent there by President McKinley in order to remove American civilians and get them out of harm's way. Well, while it was in port, it exploded and was destroyed. That was, again, the icing on the cake. Nobody knew what really happened, so there was a lot of, again, with the journalists, the yellow journalism, there was a lot of speculation. There was a bounty placed on the Spaniards who had sunk or destroyed the USS Maine, and it was really becoming a thing. So between the letter and the growing sense of nationalism or the extreme, we'll call it extreme patriotism, that was really leading now at this point to demands that the U.S. declare war on Spain. So the U.S. remained largely isolationist up to this point. It was a hands-off Monroe Doctrine, you leave us alone, we leave you alone kind of thing. But once the Maine was destroyed, then all bets were off. McKinley asks Congress, almost couldn't get that one out. McKinley asked Congress for a declaration of war on April 11, 1898, and on April 20th, Congress agrees and war is declared. So the war in the Philippines, Spain thought for sure, based on everything that happened, that the U.S. would come for Cuba first. They didn't. They didn't. When you're sometimes in a strategic war, you figure out, okay, where do they think I'm not going to show up? And the Americans showed up in the Philippines. And Admiral Dewey, Commodore, I keep saying Admiral, Commodore George Dewey opens fire on the Spanish fleet on April 30th, the Philippine Islands, and destroys the fleet. The Filipinos, they won independence from Spain also, so they helped with the revolt. And in August of 1898, Spain surrenders to the U.S. regarding the Philippines. In the Caribbean, the war begins with a naval blockade around Cuba. They essentially blockade the harbor of Santiago de Cuba. They blockade the harbor, which keeps the Spanish fleet bottled up where it is, and they can't get to where they want to go to help defend their ground troops. The Navy, the American Navy, was very strong. They had been proving themselves for quite a period of time now, and the American Navy, the U.S. Navy, was very strong. The ground forces, however, were weak. We had a very small professional army at that point, and we had to recruit a lot of volunteers. For this war, actually, about 125,000 men volunteered for battle, but they were untrained. We had a very poor training regiment. They were very poorly supplied. And the leaders were basically Civil War leaders that if you think about, that time, that was no longer a modern day battle. The Civil War times had advanced so much, even in this short period of time, 30 years plus, that it was a whole different way of fighting at this point, technology-wise and tactics-wise. So we were really a little bit unprepared. A lack of experienced officers, training, supplies were poor. So was that trouble? Was that trouble for us? Could it have been? And probably had we met a more formidable force on the ground in Cuba, or had the Spanish Navy been able to operate the way that they had wanted to. Rough Riders. June of 1898, there we go. American forces land in Cuba, 17,000 strong. It includes 4 regiments of African American fighters, as well as the Rough Riders. And the Rough Riders are certainly famously made by Teddy Roosevelt, but among others. But Teddy Roosevelt, I'm going like this because there's a picture, as you all know, over in this corner of Teddy Roosevelt. But the Rough Riders became a thing. The Battle of Kettle Hill, and then the one that's more famous, although it was shorter actually than Kettle Hill, San Juan Hill, both were fought. And at that point, that sealed the deal for the American ground forces. The Spanish fleet, at that point, realizing that things weren't going well, attempt to run the blockade out of the harbor, and they are met face-to-face with the American Navy and suffer tremendous losses. Once that happens, the victory in Cuba is virtually assured. With that victory, that propelled the United States to go one step further and achieve Puerto Rico the same way, by taking it by force. So the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris, first of all, a ceasefire was declared after all of the military action that went down after Cuba and, of course, with Puerto Rico. And in August 12, 1898, a ceasefire was declared. John Hay, who was Secretary of State at the time, has the most famous quote. It's published in a lot of places, and it's remembered quite a lot for the way he characterized the war, which was a splendid little war. I don't know anybody who's ever been in battle who might think it was a splendid time to be at war, but that's the way it was categorized, and that's the way it lives on. December 10, 1898, the treaty was signed. Cuba was freed. Guam and Puerto Rico, the territories that did belong to Spain, were turned over to the United States, and the Philippine Islands were purchased for $20 million from Spain by the United States. The debate over the Treaty of Paris created a debate in the United States, and the debate was, we fought for our own independence, and we should allow territories that are freed to govern, to self-govern. I mean, that's what our Declaration of Independence says. The Treaty of Paris was created, which created the debate: was it right to annex the Philippines after freeing them from Spain? McKinley needed to justify imperialism of the United States, so what he said was, well, we should Christianize them, okay? And what he didn't realize was, especially in the Philippines, which is what we're talking about, they had been mostly Christian for quite a period of time. But he was using that excuse in order to justify, A, the annexation of additional territory, rather than allowing a freed nation to self-govern, which is what we believed in, and I should say, the resources that were there. Because imperialism, again, as you know, was all about resources. Some people brought up that it was against the Declaration of Independence by not allowing self-governing to newly acquired territories. February 6, 1899, the Senate ratifies the Treaty of Paris, and that pretty much puts the whole thing to bed. And there's no more discussion, relatively, about that. And the last thing, which is the next thing, and was on everybody's mind because we're still in the period of time of imperialism, which was, how will the U.S. expand next? So next time, we'll talk a little bit more about how the U.S. plans to expand next. Thank you for listening. You can see this again, or you're seeing it on Google Classroom right now, and use this to supplement the other materials that are on there. Respond, please, to the questions that I'm giving you. Make sure you keep an eye on your due date. And most of all, keep those hands washed. All right, take care, everybody, and be well.